I am Kyle Edward Ball, director of Skinamarink, and you're listening to contrazoompod.
This is ContraZoom,
where we go back and forth about film.
I'm Dakota Arsenault.
And I'm Rachel Ho.
On this podcast, we like to celebrate both Canadian films and Halloween. Last week, we observed the 45th anniversary of the classic John Carpenter slasher film, Halloween. Today, we're looking at some more spooky films. Joining us is Kyle Edward Ball, the writer and director of the surprise indie horror film, Skinamarink. Kyle originally got a start on YouTube recreating people's nightmares they sent him on his channel Bite-Sized Nightmares, before making the short film Heck. Kyle was gracious enough to submit a ballot for our greatest films of all time poll where he voted for such horror films like The Birds, Mulholland Drive, and of course, The Wizard of Oz. Welcome to the show, Kyle. It's great to finally have you on.
It's great to be here. You know, The Wizard of Oz, actually, weird anecdote about that in horror, like sometimes lay people, like people who aren't like in film Twitter or like cinephile circles, they provide unique perspectives on things. And one time my ex-boyfriend, he referred to The Wizard of Oz as the first real horror movie, which was like, if you hear it, doesn't make sense. But if you think about it, that's his concept of a horror, which is color, drama, like a certain type of melodrama. So... yeah.
And the witches and the monkey people.
Yeah, right.
They're freaky. I kind of am with him there. I think they're kind of scary.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. My mom refuses to rewatch the movie because she was so traumatized by the flying monkeys when she was a child.
Yeah.
Well, that's a shame. It is really such like a powerful piece of cinema. Like there's a reason why of all the like family films made of that era, that one really still stands out.
I have to say, I have a hard time with that movie sometimes now because the more that I know about Judy Garland, the more her stuff makes me sad. And so watching that movie, which is like, it isn't a horror, like there are scary bits to it, but like it just makes me think a little bit more about that. Like the older that I got, when I first saw it, I remember really loving it. And then, as I got older, it became a little sad. But we're not here to talk about Wizard of Oz.
It so much, actually.
Yeah. So I do want to take things back a little bit before we get into today's subject. Back on July 15th, 2022, a full week before Skinamarink had its world premiere at the Fantasia Film Festival, I got a message from Rachel as we were both sifting through the Fantasia program and screeners to decide on what to cover for our podcast episode that week. And it read, "Watch Skinamarink. I legit can't remember the last time I was that scared. Sent you the screener." To which I replied, "Ha ha ha, I'll probably skip it then, because I'm notoriously a chicken and very picky about what horror movies I'll watch." And Rachel telling me it was one of the scariest movies that she'd ever seen was a big no from me. And it took me almost 9 months to finally watch your film. After Rachel's review went up on Exclaim, the first one that I noticed, I started seeing other reviews pouring in, all claiming the same thing. Your movie was becoming the talk of the festival and horror circuit at the time. And I was wondering if you can take us back to July 2022 and talk about your experience of showing the film for the first time.
About a month before, we were in the process of submitting to a handful of festivals, but Fantasia was the big one that I really wanted to get into. And they had already announced their first and second wave of titles, and I thought, okay, it's looking less and less likely. And I had a really bad night where I had this feeling like, oh, maybe this was all for naught. Maybe I failed. Maybe the movie's no good. And then I woke up to an email from Fantasia, and it felt like getting the golden ticket, right? Like And so I was super excited for it. Fantasia, they paid for our hotel, and my friend Edmund paid for our airfare out there. I'd never been to Montreal before and loved it. Like I loved Montreal. And then Fantasia, they did a really good job of making us feel special and important. Like they took us out for dinner beforehand. Before the screening, they did a tech demo of the movie in the theater to say, okay, are you okay with the levels of sound? Are you okay with how it's being projected? Like everything. They have a really good system at Fantasia. And then I introed the movie. I watched the audience the whole time, and I got just a feeling from the audience that was very like, this is how I wanted them to react. And then afterwards, very tellingly, because the screening finished at like 11, like close to midnight on a Thursday during the week, and 80% of the audience stayed for the Q&A, which I thought was fairly strong, right? And then after leaving Fantasia, we got our first handful of reviews from like reputable outlets, all of which were positive. One of which was like a perfect 5 out of 5. And I told my producer, like, Edmund, there's a chance, like, I don't think every movie that plays at Fantasia gets, like, usually the first handful of reviews from film festivals skew to more positive. Mm-hmm. But I felt that this was different. And I told Edmund, like, this might be talked about the same way people talk about the Sundance premiere of Blair Witch. Mm-hmm. And that turned out to be correct, because since it came out, there were so many things that matched up with the Blair Witch release and response. So that was cool.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that assessment, because, Rachel and I cover a lot of film festivals, and even Fantasia. We both love Fantasia, and there'll be stuff where like, yeah, that was fun, but like, is it a good movie? I don't know. And so there definitely was a different feeling watching the reactions come out about Skinamarink. And you're absolutely right. Thinking about, I wasn't paying attention when Blair Witch came out, but I definitely remember looking back and sort of reading the praise that it got and sort of the life it took on after it premiered on Sundance.
Yeah, the Sundance, the whole, and even an interesting thing with Blair Witch is there's an infamous Sundance copy of the movie, which is fairly identical visually to the theatrical version, but very importantly, the original Sundance version had very bad audio. So they used more of the raw actual audio that had been recorded, which would be like, for example, at the beginning of Blair Witch Project, they interview all these townspeople. In the original Sundance version, the audio is so bad that you can't even necessarily make out what people are saying. So they'll like interview a waitress, and you'll hear the hum of the fridge in the background and other stuff too, so I was able to get a copy of the Sundance audio version, and it's actually not as bad as you'd expect, and I would say helps the movie because it sounds a bit more real. But in 1999, I think the distributor kind of made the easy assessment of, okay, well, a mainstream audience will not sit through audio this bad, right? Like an audience will sit through shaky cam and messy footage, but they won't sit through bad audio, right? So I think they did make the right, they supposedly, I think, spent $250,000 American to clean up the audio.
Wow.
And they did a good job, but
that's pretty crazy. I'm curious, for a film that was, crowdfunded and shot on a $15,000 budget over the course of 7 days, it then went on and made over 2 million worldwide, was distributed by Shudder, received an exclusive Steelbook DVD and Blu-ray release from Walmart, and a limited run a set of white, blue, and black VHS tapes from Lunchmeat VHS that sold out immediately. How do you feel about the way the horror community has embraced your film?
It's been basically a dream come true, but there's been weird stuff with it too, because obviously the film is presented in a strange kind of unique way, which polarizes audiences. And as a kid, like the dream was always, oh, I want to be controversial, I want to be edgy, I want walkouts, I want this, I want that. And the weird thing is that happened, but not for the reason that I had hoped for. When I was a kid, I thought, oh, it's going to be so edgy and dark and gore and blah, blah, blah. Like all those, I'm going to be like spooky John Waters, right? And the weird poetic kind of irony is that all happened, but it was because like a lot of people were like, this is just fucking hallways, right? So it's weird how stuff happens, but it doesn't happen the way you'd hope for, right? So it's the horror community for the most part has been great, but I'd be lying if I said, I do occasionally get hate mail and hate tweets, and those do get under my skin. But the thing is, if I was thicker skinned, I don't think you get a movie like Skinamarink, right? Mm. Like, so it's a strange dichotomy, that's for sure. But I would say for every one hate comment, I get 20 positive. So, I still really do feel I'm still to this day the luckiest filmmaker on the planet right now, even well after the release. So
how have you dealt with that though? I know that like it's human nature more or less that, you said you get one hate message and then you get 20 great ones, but your focus is always you're going to remember the hate one more than you're going to remember the good stuff. And you've had so much amazing things happen to you in a really, really short period of time. But like you said, the movie was kind of divisive and there were people that had strong opinions on the other side. So did you have like good people or people around you trying to like help you out? Or was that just you just trudging through and being like, well, you kind of got to get through it?
Yeah, it was kind of just me trudging through. And I want to be clear too, like, it's not the negative reviews or negative comments about the movie that get under my skin. Mm-hmm. It's the people who explicitly message me or explicitly at me on Twitter. That's what pisses me. Like, if you hate
so unnecessary, isn't it?
Yeah,
it's like if that's not,
like you're entitled to your opinion. It's the horror community, right? Like that's a part of the gig. That's what you're supposed to do. But if you explicitly go out of your way to message me, like, that does piss me off. And I try my best to ignore it. I don't even try to block them, because then that still feels like they kind of got something. They can then screenshot that and say, look, he blocked me, right? But I'm human and it's hard sometimes, right? And people are weird with it too, particularly with this film. They feel this. I've had a few times where people very polite, nice, will talk to me and talk about how they respect the movie, and then like sneak in like, and I really didn't like the movie. And it's like, okay, okay, you didn't need to give that information to me, right? Like, and it's like, okay, it's not, this wasn't, it's just bizarre. But in the same vein, to be fair to them, they don't necessarily know the rules of engagement for a movie like this or talking to a director, right? Mm-hmm. So in their mind, maybe they see it as this weird badge of honor, or maybe they see it as something I'm emotionally detached from. So it's been tricky, and I think I have been getting better at it. I think like writing my script for my next movie has grounded me and kept me focused, and so yeah.
I think you're being very kind, because even if you say that people don't know how to deal with the director, it's like you can deal with other human beings, and you wouldn't
Yeah.
say that. Like, you know
I
what I
mean,
mean? You just don't say that, but
yeah, but there's certain social interactions that they're like people. I really don't think a lot of them are trying to be mean or hurtful, and like there's different degrees of it, right? Like I
yeah.
had a Zoom meeting with the people who at Seed and Spark, the crowdfunding company, because they wanted to do a kind of, oh, this was a Seed and Spark success story, right? And the woman who runs Seed and Spark said, like, look, I have a 4-year-old and a 6-year-old kid. I could not watch. And I was like, that's completely fair. Right. Like,
Yeah.
so there's different levels, and these interactions can be messy. Right. So,
Interesting.
That's fair.
Hey, quiet! It's him again!
Jingle bell rock.
Listen, you pervert, why don't you go over to Lambakai? They could use a little of this.
Jingle bells square in the frosty air.
Yeah, I was supposed to meet my daughter here. Her name's Claire Harrison. Do you know her?
I'm sure you'll find her at the fraternity house.
So, as I mentioned at the top on this podcast, we like to celebrate both Canadian films and horror. And since you're a horror filmmaker from Edmonton, Alberta, you are the perfect person to have on. We asked you to name 3 iconic and influential Canadian horror films, and you gave us the first one being Black Christmas from 1974, directed by Bob Clark. Rituals from 1977, directed by Peter Carter, and Scanners from 1981, directed by David Cronenberg. Before we get into these movies specifically, I'd love to know your experiences with Canadian horror in general and how you gravitated towards them.
well, yeah, it was always Canadian horror. A lot of it I saw through the lens of Cronenberg, because he is such a monolith in the Canadian horror mythos since the 1970s, right? So he is kind of our golden boy, he's kind of our John Carpenter, so to speak. Like, I really like his late 70s to late 80s period in particular. And outside of that, it's really just a handful of movies that really stand out in certain weird ways, right? So one in particular was Black Christmas, which growing up I had never really gotten into. And then my boyfriend, or ex-boyfriend, I should say now, he really liked that one and talked to how atmospheric and cozy it was. So as an adult, I gave it a second, like a thorough actual watch through. And it is a real masterclass in horror, and also in atmosphere, and also, like, I don't know if people talk about this enough. Black Christmas is really, even compared to today, and I think Rachel might have thoughts on, but like, incredibly feminist in a way that the slasher movies of the 80s really were not. Like, abortion is talked about very frankly in it. There's an entire subplot around the main character's relationship with her boyfriend, and how at one point he meets her and says, I decided I'm going to quit college and we're going to make a go of it together, and I'm going to do this. And she says, well, what about me? Like, you didn't ask me. What about what I want to do? Right. And it really, another big thing too, is the main characters in it, like the sorority, right? They're all fully developed personalities and fully developed. They're not just, oh, these are the 3 or 5 women we need to see the killer kill, right? Like, they're fully developed, thoughtful protagonists. not just stereotype and funny and play off each other in such unique. It is so incredibly thoughtfully well written, kind of feminist cinema. Oddly enough, directed by a man who his other claim to fame is A Christmas Story.
And Porky's.
Yeah, and Porky's,
yeah.
which is not a feminist masterpiece by any means. So it's kind of weird. Like, I know everyone makes this joke, but he did 2 Christmas movies, one happy one not happy one, and said, I'm done, and then moved on, right? So.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, Black Christmas is basically the grandfather of all slasher films. It was the direct inspiration for Halloween and countless others. And you had actually said in an interview for Fangoria that Black Christmas has a lot of shots where there's just panning. I would refer to it when talking with my director of photography who hadn't seen Black Christmas. This is my Black Christmas shot. So we all know that the film was a direct inspiration on parts of Skinamarink. And for anyone that doesn't know the plot, it's a sorority house that's terrorized by a stranger who makes frightening phone calls and then murders the sorority sisters during Christmas break. I'd love to know, you were talking about the first time that you saw this film. I'd love to know a little bit more about the sort of the inspiration that it had on Skinamarink.
Well, a big thing with Black Christmas is there's lots of shots where there is no one seen on screen, and you hear them. So you hear people downstairs talking or having drinks on Christmas and party, and then you see like a shot of a hallway upstairs. And a few years ago, and the video since, I haven't been able to find it, which is a real shame. Someone did a compilation of here are all the shots of Black Christmas where someone is not present. And they edited it all together, and it is the most atmospheric, creeping footage you have ever seen. It is just shots of a house in, I think it was filmed in Montreal, just sort of existing, right? And the menace of a house and how at night, particularly in winter, a house can be so big and imposing, and the shadows can feel like they stretch forever. And I utilized that and copied that for Skinamarink. I think to a certain amount of success. And just talking to Black Christmas, the amount of atmosphere, because atmosphere really does the heavy lifting in Black Christmas. And I tried to emulate. And another thing too is the panning, right? So it'll shoot someone in a room, and then it'll pan to the hallway, and then it'll pan to another thing, and then it'll pan. It does all this stuff with just the camera work that we don't necessarily think of when we think of horror. In the modern context, when you think of horror, like elegant camera horror work, it's often follow shots and tracking shots and dolly shots, and not just a simple, we have a camera, we pan, we look over here, then we move, we look over there, then we move, we look over there. Just the simple elegance of the camera work in Black Christmas.
It's very voyeuristic.
Mm-hmm.
And I will say, Black Christmas was filmed completely in Toronto, and the house was a University of Toronto. I don't know if it was a frat house or a sorority house, but it was an old university housing house.
Yeah, I thought it was Montreal too.
No.
Well,
no.
I think I know what it is. It's based on a supposed real life story that happened in Montreal.
Interesting. Kyle, did you find when you were trying to like mimic the atmospheric stuff, like any surprising difficulties in doing that? Like when you and you kind of maybe develop like a deeper appreciation for Black Christmas because you're like, oh shit, that was a lot harder than I thought it was going to be.
Yeah, a lot of it was shooting stuff and not knowing whether it was going to read in the edit was a big thing, right? Because you can do something like have a house lighted a certain way and pan from point A to point B to point C and timing it, right?
Yeah.
Without it being too long or too short, right? Like you really had to kind of time it a certain way. So timing was a big thing. Trusting that it would come together in edit and make sense in a certain way was a big thing. And also shooting around a house that doesn't necessarily work, right? So Black Christmas, I think they had full reign of the set. The house was decked out to work for it. But the problem in my movie was it was set in 1995, and there's only so much you can do to a house currently without having to do something like completely gut the kitchen, right? Like we had to shoot around my parents' kitchen and avoid it and light it and grate it because my parents' kitchen is completely modern. All the appliances read as 2000s, right? So that was another difficulty thing too, where we had to get creative.
One thing that I really appreciated with Black Christmas was that the logic was very consistent. It was very impressive how they managed to, as they're doing the different kills of these women, that it made sense of why they weren't in the picture anymore. So you have someone that's leaving for vacation, so everyone's assumed that she's already gone, or this person's gone out for the night and won't be coming back, or they're out with their partner, or things like that. And too often I find in horror movies, there's just no logic. And eventually the movie sort of catches up where they realize that one person was supposed to be picked up by their father, one of the women, and she never showed up. And that sort of starts the whole investigation of where she is and what might be going on. But I really appreciate throughout the film, it was very consistent of keeping logic as a focal point to not letting the movie go off the rails. Is that something that, I know Skinamarink is very much its own thing, but is that something that you're cognizant about when you're either watching horror movies or when you're writing yourself, is figuring a way of keeping the logic there?
Yeah, that's a tricky thing too, because horror communities in particular will watch for it and critique it. And another big thing is it's always hard of how do I keep people at the location without it being unbelievable. And another thing too is how do I feasibly, because another big thing I really like about Black Christmas is they go to the police and the police react realistically, right? Like in horror movies, I swear to God, someone will be like, there's a dead body, and the police will be like, oh, they probably fell, right? And it's just
Yeah.
so ridiculous, right? Like, in real life, the police wouldn't be as blasé about these instances, and they always have to find this weird circular logic as to why the police aren't taking this obvious crime seriously. And in Black Christmas, it's done very smartly, and the police are reacting very realistically to what the situation is entailed. It's almost as if when they were writing it, they said, okay, what would actually happen in this circumstance, if we had these characters in this setting at this time of year with this situation, how would it pan out? And how can we still make it work, still make a story out of it, right? Mm-hmm. So that was a big thing I learned from Black Christmas, is making the motivations, the actions believable within a certain context, right? Because you can't be Cassavetes for everything, right? You do have to kind of have a little bit of a story arc, mm-hmm. But I really think Black Christmas should be shown in film schools in general, just for this is how you keep it believable within the confines of this is still a movie.
Yeah. Yeah, the whole time I was watching the movie, I wanted to just keep writing notes in my notebook being like, yeah, that makes sense. Ooh, those actions actually make sense. That dialogue is believable. The way they're approaching all these situations all makes sense.
And Margot Kidder just kind of steals the show as the drunk one, right? Like, yes. She has so many good like she has the best like they get the first obscene phone call, and and some girl says something to the effect of like, who do you think it was, or do you think it was a prank call, and or some pervert? And she says, oh no, it's the Mormon Tabernacle Choir doing their annual obscene phone call. Like, that's the other thing too, they're all perfectly developed characters, right? They're not just, oh, we have 5 sorority girls who get killed. Like, they're so, or even Andrea Martin, who later went on to be on SCTV. Her character isn't just the girl with glasses who's dorky and probably the smart, studious one. Like, she is so endearing and so well developed, and the relations between the two. Like, I remember at one point, I think it's even after what Margot Kidder says, this other girl said, she didn't mean it, Barb. Like, it's so tight and smart, and yeah, I could talk about Black Christmas all day.
The last thing I'll say about it is my favorite piece of trivia I learned about it was that before Andrea Martin was cast, originally Gilda Radner was offered the part.
Oh,
and I love that.
Oh my God, that would have been that. I didn't know that. That's insane.
Mm-hmm. And I love it because the character isn't an inherently funny one. Margot Kidder, I think, does have the most funny lines in the movie, but it's so funny that, 2 of the most iconic female Canadian comedians were offered the same part.
Yeah, that's interesting. And it's not the comedic relief character. Mm-hmm. It's Margot Kidder is kind of the comedic relief character.
Yeah.
Oh, and she has that brilliant, like, thing with the police. Oh, can you spell it out? And she's like, oh, it's fellatio. And he spells it out. And then the idiot cop is like, no, this girl wanted to give me fellatio.
All right, let us move on. The next movie is one called Rituals.
If you go down in the woods today, you're sure of a big surprise.
If you go down in the woods today, you're sure of a big surprise.
This animal has only been dead for a couple of hours.
Look, Harry, somebody's playing a very sick game with us, and I want to know who, and I want to know why.
If you go down in the woods today, you better go in disguise.
April's dead, Harry.
Was it a man?
For every man that ever there was will gather there for certain because today's the day the teddy bears have their picnic.
It's probably the least known movie of the 3 you named, but it is about 5 doctors who go camping in the remote woods of northern Ontario. When their boots are stolen, they begin to suspect that they are being stalked. The film stars Hal Holbrook, but aside from being a Canadian version of Deliverance, is far more gritty and grimy, feeling like a precursor to something like the Blair Witch Project, which you've already brought up. The film is in dire need of a remastering, but the lo-fi nature of it makes it feel like a home video gone wrong. How did this movie come across your radar?
It was really down to it showed up on Shudder one day, and I watched it because I had heard of it before. I think I had seen some. Remember that cable horror channel Scream?
Mm-hmm.
I think they had a brief thing about it and Canadian horror in general, and just the weird because I don't even think they mention at any point, oh yeah, we're in Canada, we're in Ontario, but there's weird hints to it too, where it just feels so Canadian. And I think in particular, they're always drinking Molson or some Canadian beer brand during it because they're camping, blah, blah, blah. And another thing that, yeah, like it is a little, like I'm sure they pitched, oh yeah, this is basically Deliverance when they were trying to get financing. So it's these middle-aged guys, which I think adds to the horror too. Like, these aren't kids, right? Like, these are theory grown-ass people who can't get out of the situation, right? Another thing I really like too about it is just there's that weird, like, just archetypal 70s, like, harmonica and strings theme at the beginning of the movie, and then at the end of credits when the guy's just sitting on the road and the sunset is coming up, and it's a little sweet in weird ways, right?
Yeah, you could definitely sort of feel the 70s Canadiana to it all.
Mm-hmm.
But once again, I feel like the concept of logic permeates this movie as well. You know, you already mentioned that these are middle-aged guys, so they're not teenagers, so they're already sort of thinking about, okay, we need to think like adults and not be irrational, things like that. But also on the fact that they're all doctors, so when they start to get hurt, they're like, okay, this is what it probably is. This is what we need to do to make sure this person stays safe and they don't get infected. Okay, do we have to consider amputation? All this sort of stuff that goes on makes the dialogue seem so intelligent and realistic as well.
Yeah, like that's another added thing too of, okay, you know, in a horror movie, there'll be a situation where people are stranded or trapped and someone's injured and they don't know how to deal with it. And in this context, they do, but it doesn't matter, right? If someone's determined enough to kill you and you don't have a means of escape, they're going to kill you, right? Which adds to the tension and fear of it, right? So, we have an easy, like in a lesser movie, they would have made them maybe more vulnerable, but this was almost a although you could also argue that because they're all doctors, that's a way of keeping them alive longer, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it just comes into the, you know, how do we make this horror movie different? What's an angle we can do to make this different and not different from Deliverance, for example? And okay, well, maybe they're all doctors, right? And that feeds into, and it also is just a very simple, okay, well, what's an example of, why are these guys all going fishing? Oh, well, maybe they all work together, or they're all associates, or all know each other through okay, what's the job? Oh, well, let's say they're all doctors, right? It could have been just as simple as that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
The movie also has some queer undertones in it as well, because there's a very brief scene where one of the characters admits that he had a failed relationship with another man, and unfortunately it does lead to a bit of a homophobic outburst from one of the other characters. But I was still sort of surprised at just how matter-of-factly it was just inserted in the middle of an argument that the two men were having, and then it was just kind of moved on, where we're just like, okay, this is just who this person is, which I thought was so fascinating for a film from 1977.
Actually, yeah, I watched it with my boyfriend, and we were really surprised by it, and how, like, you occasionally see movies like from the 70s where there's a queer character and it's done surprisingly thoughtfully. And surprising, like I think we even rewound it to make sure we heard it right. And we were quite impressed by it. And it's kind of a sad reminder, too, of how in the 70s, the gay rights movement was gaining a lot of steam and making a lot of progress. And then the AIDS epidemic stopped it and reversed it a lot, where we didn't really get a footing again till the mid-90s. So that's a kind of an interesting thing too, that you really see in horror movies and movies in general before the AIDS epidemic happened, where you don't really see it in the 80s and even the early 90s because of all the stigma and hate that the queer community got because of the AIDS epidemic. So that was an interesting thing that I'm happy you brought up.
Mm-hmm.
I've never put that together, and that's like a very obvious thing, but I've actually never put those two and two together for that. That's really interesting.
It's hard, like it's just a thing too, because if you were born at a certain time, you don't even necessarily think about, and even it also has to have the context too of knowing about the queer movement in the 70s, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because if you don't know about that and the progress that was made, then it's assumed, okay, well, this was just a natural trajectory of, okay, things got better, right? But it's kind of something that goes against our intuition of how rights movements work, because we are kind of trained to think it's a natural trajectory towards the top, and that's not always the case. Sometimes there's progress made and then a giant dip in the progress that's been made.
And then the last thing I want to kind of touch on with this movie is this possibly the most unsafe movie ever made, or one of them? Because I'm watching this movie, and the main, inciting incident is that they get their boots stolen. So most of the guys are just in their socks, and then they have plastic bags over their feet. And I would hope they had some sort of foot protection going on under there, but they're walking around on rocks and hilly forests, all that sort of stuff. They're trudging through the water, and all this time you could see that they don't really have any real safety precautions going on. And I know this was a different era of filmmaking, but like, as a director, do you watch stuff like this and just like hope that these actors were being taken care of?
I viscerally thought when I was watching this, thinking this was a nightmare to film. I would never I would never agree, just because I'm not a camping person in general. So with that aside, I did viscerally think like, okay, the mosquitoes, the muck and mire of this, they're not acting.
Yeah.
That's real. And again, I doubt they got to the end of this without some form of injury, or at the very least heavy mosquito rash, just for filming that. And again, I even thought too, like, oh my God, bringing the generators to shoot this thing. How many times were they like, fuck, I wish I didn't sign on to this movie. I could have worked it. I could have done so many other things than this movie.
Yeah.
Just because the thing is, horror can be a ton of fun to film. Like screaming, pretending to be scared, all the fun gore and guts and goo and this and that. But I get the sense this was not a particularly fun film to make.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree.
I would like to scan all of you in this room, one at a time.
There are 4 billion people on Earth. 237 are scanners. They'll control your mind, conquer your will, manipulate your body like a toy.
Self-destruct, 5 seconds.
The pain begins. And your flesh. In your brain.
4 seconds.
You feel its power.
3 seconds.
The pressure. The pounding. The terror.
2 seconds.
All right, I want to move on to our last movie, and it is the king of Canadian horror, and that's David Cronenberg and his film Scanners. The film came out right before his massive breakthrough, both artistically and monetarily, and while it's more of a thriller rather than scary, it still features plenty of disgusting body horror. In it, after a man with extraordinary and frighteningly destructive telepathic abilities is nabbed by agents from a mysterious rogue corporation, he discovers he is far from the only possessor of such strange powers, and that some of the other scanners have their minds set on world domination, while others are trying to stop them. As someone whose work is much more minimalist compared to Cronenberg's over-the-top exploration of the human body and its limits, what draws you into the world of DC?
My initial interaction with David Cronenberg was The Fly, and the reason the first time I saw it, I think it's because my mom had rented it, because my mom really likes the movie The Fly. And
Jeff Goldblum. It's a Jeff Goldblum thing.
It's not just, and that just the feelings and things like The Fly. When I was initially emailing you guys, I said, well, can we do The Fly? But you said, well, I don't know if that's technically Canadian horror, which it's not. Like, it was American funding, but it still feels like such a Toronto movie.
Yeah,
like
100%.
When you watch it, it's like, this is Toronto, right? Like, which obviously adds to the horror. I kid. But so that was what got me into it too. And then when I became a teenager, I started getting into more of his back catalog. And of course watched Scanners, which on top of the entire meme of the exploding head thing, is such a methodical, artsy movie. I like, and here's a hard thing. I am not necessarily always the best at articulating why I like a movie or not, which is why I don't think I could ever be a film critic. Like, I couldn't necessarily write down, okay, here's why I like the movie, here's why I didn't. Scanners is one of those movies. I can't even necessarily articulate why I appreciate or enjoy it that much. I was able to watch, my friend had a Blu-ray of it, so I invited him over to watch it this past weekend for this pod, so that it would be fresh in my mind for this podcast, because Black Christmas I've seen a billion times. I don't need to rewatch to talk about. But I'd be interested to hear your guys' thoughts on Scanners.
What are my thoughts? You know what I find that I think is interesting, and it's kind of common to what you were talking about with Black Christmas and with your own movies, is Scanners is a very, very atmospheric movie on its own. Like, I find it to be, maybe it's because it is Toronto and it is like a certain time period, but I find it to be an incredibly atmospheric film, despite the big, set pieces that they do with it. And, everyone always focuses on the exploding head, like you mentioned, but there's so many other things in this film that I think are very worthwhile to discuss. And I like Michael Ironside alone. Like, he's somebody that I think you can pinpoint his entire, like, he's not even in it. Like, no, he is, but I find this one of those interesting movies that it was probably one of my first 5 Cronenbergs I saw, because I watched a couple and then I went to go watch them in chronological order. So this is one of his earlier ones, and I think it's incredibly Cronenberg. I think that this is kind of the movie that you start to get that Cronenbergian thing to him that has made him so successful. And I do really like this movie. It's one of my top Cronenberg movies, probably.
I've noticed too, so outside of the obvious body horror, with Cronenberg, you'll often see a plot like this where it's a mystery to uncover, but done in a very specific way, where you'll have someone, they'll go to see someone will fill them in on it. So it's almost his weird take on doing a procedural, where and he has a very explicit kind of cold dialogue. Yeah. And it really reminded me of Videodrome, just in the way there's a guy or a person, they uncover this idea, this mystery, they go on a quest, and they meet this incredibly odd character. And there always seems to be a overarching organization or shadowy company, and there always seems to be 2 versions of it. So for the example in this, there's the medical company, and then there's the underground faction of Scanners, which you see mimicked in Videodrome. So Videodrome, there's the TV company, and then through the guy's interest in pirated signals, he finds Videodrome, right? The underground, right? And you see that mimicked a lot. Or even in The Fly, right? You have mainstream science and you have the mad scientist, right? So you see that a lot with Cronenberg, is the dichotomy of the 2 organizations, 2 entities, one who's typically the corporate side and the other is the without, right? So the rogue, right? And you can also see mirrors in that in the body horror aspect. So you have the standard body and then the horror of it, right? And the way it kind of overlaps and that whole thing.
I think Cronenberg, for as innovative as he is, I think you hit it on the nail there of saying, like, he can be very formulaic. But what I find really fascinating about him is that even though it's formulaic and you can see the threads when you kind of take a step back, all of his movies, not all of them actually, he does have some stinkers, but it's like they're all very exciting and they're all very interesting films. And he manages to kind of not make 2 films seem the exact way. despite having that formula. And I would also say a lot of people have tried to copy Cronenberg and have been inspired by Cronenberg for good reason. But I actually don't think at all that there's anybody that has done Cronenberg like Cronenberg, which I find very, very impressive after all these years.
Another thing and this came from me just rewatching Scanners with my friend. He has a particular thing with dialogue that he writes, and I said to my friend, like, you need an amazing cast to make this dialogue work. Because if you didn't have a good actor, it is just so ridiculous, right? Like, they're talking about this, it's almost comic book-esque. But we did this, but we'll do this. And then, but if you had a bad cast, it would not, would be so laughable. But because he casts his movie so well, it reads, it sings. You don't laugh at it, right?
Yeah.
He very much has found a way to make a very specific form of dialogue, which can read very cold.
Very.
Work in a certain way.
I think he has like a vision or like a sonic vision in his head of how he wants his dialogue to sound, and then he's able to get that out of his actors. Like I find him. I could talk about Cronenberg endlessly. I think that he's just such a fascinating director because, like you said, one, he casts his characters really, really well, but he also knows how to get exactly what he's looking for, like all of those hits. Because you're right, if any other actor, anybody else, like handling those scenes from an actor's point, but also from a director's point, it would be ridiculous. Like it would be so campy and cheesy and honestly just kind of stupid. The dialogue would be just kind of stupid. Yeah. But somehow the way he does it, it reads. It sounds really stupid, or sounds kind of odd to say Shakespearean, but it's like bland Shakespeare. Like it's this kind of cold Shakespearean way, but it's very unique to him, though. Again, very impressive human being, David Cronenberg.
Another thing too is just the weird world building, right? So someone will bring up something like, okay, so we know this amount of scanners, this, that. And in this world, you're guessing whether is this common knowledge or is this just this underground group of people who are aware of and he has this way, and you see it. I think the biggest example would be Naked Lunch, right? Where people will bring up things and you'll wonder, is this just the world they inhabit, or is this underground world that is in the world that we exist in? Right. And he's a kind of master at doing that and having someone explain it without feeling like you're having these things over explained to you.
And there's a lot of rules in his movies. Like in the worlds that he builds, there are these rules, but like you said, he doesn't have them like listed out for us to read them, but you do second guess what the rules are, and it's almost part of the mystery thing that you were talking about earlier, and like it's piecing together what exactly is going on in this world, what is the right thing in relation to the world, and what is like out of pocket for this world.
Another thing that just feels it feels like these two things go together. His frequent composer collaborator, is it Howard Shore?
Yes, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like it feels like that's such a, like if you were to ever do a parody of a Cronenberg movie, you would need someone to mimic the super dramatic dun, dun, like that Howard Shore does, and I feel most iconically in The Fly, right?
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
I do want to, bring back the point that Rachel made about calling out Michael Ironside. And I just want to say how mad I am that Michael Ironside was not the biggest actor in the 80s and 90s, because he should have absolutely been. He basically turns in a performance that you can expect from someone like Jack Nicholson in this movie. Yeah. And he should have been a star. It's great that he's still getting work, but like he should have been bigger.
But he's not a star, though. He's not the actor that is like a leading star. He is like that guy. He is the dude that you're like, oh, that guy. but he's good. Like, you know what I mean? He's the character
Yeah.
actor of his generation. I think,
actor.
yeah, even though those guys don't necessarily make it big, or they're not the big movie A-list movie stars, they do serve a purpose. And when you do it well, and that Ironside does do it very, very well, in everything that he does, I think that's worth more than being, you know, the superstar dude, the it guy, because he also doesn't have a face to be an it guy, and I mean that
it's true, yeah,
in a very like respectful way.
He doesn't.
He doesn't, like, he has an interesting face. It's not just kind of a bland, boring, you know, beautiful Brad Pitt face. No offense to Brad Pitt, but it's like he has a very interesting face, and so it would almost be a waste for him to just become a Hollywood superstar.
I noticed in this one, and this was a bit like, because like I was watching with my friend, we're having drinks, blah, blah, blah. The main actor in this is that face, and he is so, it's almost like he's reading, like he's remembering the lines. Like,
yeah.
Like, I don't think he's a professional actor. Like, I think my friend said he was an artist and this wasn't his main thing. So I don't know if there was some weird creative casting. And it kind of works for this movie too, because he's kind of this naive guy. Like, he doesn't have the brooding factor that you see from protagonists in other Cronenberg movies. He does kind of stand out to the rest of the cast, where the rest of the cast is like, oh, and when we'll do this and this, and he's like, but what does that mean? Like, he's not. It's a good thing he's a scanner and can read into other people's minds, because it doesn't feel like there's a lot in his.
Yeah, the acting in the film is definitely carried by Ironside, Jennifer O'Neill, and Patrick McGoohan.
Mm-hmm.
All right, well, awesome. That was a lot of fun talking about some Canadian horror films. I loved that you picked ones that came from the mid-'70s to the early '80s. It sort of really encapsulates a certain era of Canadian filmmaking, and one that I think you yourself have sort of carried on. You know, Skinamarink takes place in the mid-'90s, but it has that very retro aesthetic to it. And you sort of feel where maybe some of that DNA has seeped into your own work.
Yeah, absolutely. Like '70s, and it's almost it's almost kind of bad. Like, I swear, it could be the worst movie ever, but if it's super '70s, I'm gonna watch it. There's just something about that era of rain and zooms, and like the '70s. I'm all here for it. So I want to just kind of tie into. So I don't think I'm telling anything out of school because it's going to be published soon, but the Globe and Mail is going to publish a list of the great Canadian horror movies. And I was very flattered that I was approached for this. I believe they'll mention Skinamarink in the article.
Amazing.
And they asked me to say what my favorite Canadian horror movie was, which of course I said Black Christmas, and I wrote a little 50-word blurb on it. So I do envision a problem for them, though, because I have a feeling almost everyone's going to say Black Christmas. So I don't know if they're going to have difficulty with, like, say, oh, shit, we should have brought in this. We should have said, please don't pick Black, because it's hard to go. Because the thing about Black Christmas, it'll frequently be featured on greatest horror of all time in general lists. Mm-hmm. So it's hard for us not to go right to that. But, you know.
You can only talk about Citizen Kane so many times. You can only talk about Black Christmas so many times, I guess.
Yeah.
Well, Kyle, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today. I know you've been busy working on your follow-up project to Skinamarink, and you can't talk much about it, but are you able to let listeners know where you are in the process of it?
Yeah, so I started writing early July, and I finished a rough draft just under a month ago, and I've been slowly going through the dreaded second draft phase, which I'm almost done, because the second draft is always the worst, because the second draft you get all the, oh, this doesn't work, it's this roller coaster doing the second draft. And the way the first draft is so fun and rewarding in its own right, the third draft is a lot of polishing. So, how can I, this scene definitely stays in. Really the third draft is a lot of, okay, the movie is set, how do I make this and this and this and this better? But the second draft is a nightmare. And I'm happy to report that I am almost finished the second draft, and hopefully I'll have the script done fairly soon, and hopefully we can go into production early next year, fingers crossed. So,
and I feel like you've made it pretty clear on social media that this is not going to be Skinamarink 2.
Yeah, although I do appreciate all the memes people make about Skinamarink sequel, so keep those coming. And also, I do want to make very clear that this will be horror with no holdbacks. It's not going to be it's horror, but this is horror. Like, this is going to be horror.
Awesome.
Well, hopefully it doesn't take me 9 months to get up the courage to watch it this time.
We'll see.
Now, if listeners wish to learn more about your work or you, what's the best place to go, Kyle?
Twitter's always good. I'm just at Kyle Edward Ball on Twitter. And there is my YouTube channel, but I haven't posted to that in forever. But it seems like, just judging from the comment notifications I get, that there's still fairly active comment community on there. But really just at Kyle Edward Ball. If Twitter is still there when you get to it, because it feels like it's this weird sinking ship that no one really wants to leave.
I can attest to that, yeah.
Yeah, like people are like, and people, we bitch about it, and there's reason to bitch about it, but like I don't want to jump to any other platform. Like, I really do. Twitter can be so fun, particularly comedy Twitter is so fun. Like, there's a certain thing about comedy tweets that don't read on other platforms, and that's my thing.
Well, we really appreciate you taking your time today and talking with us.
Thank you so much. Thank you to the contrazoompod listeners, and thank you Dakota and Rachel.
Thanks, Kyle.
And Rachel, what about you? I know you've been off for the last couple of weeks, but is there anything that you're working on that you want to promote, or just where people can find you?
Go rachelho.com. It's really old now. It's almost a year old now, but I will just, what's the word? I will promote the interview I did with Kyle back in, I think it came out in January of this year, and that's on Exclaim, because that was a lot of fun to do.
If you think I haven't already pulled that up and saved that to include in the show notes, you are sorely mistaken and forget how thoughtful I am.
I'm very, like, there's a few pieces that I've written that I'm quite happy with, and that's one of them.
It is a great one. Yeah, I'm going to include both your original review of the film and your interview with him as well.
Cool. Thank you.
This has been a That Shelf podcast. Visit thatshelf.com for more great film discourse. Follow the show on Instagram, Twitter, and Threads at contrazoompod. What are your favorite Canadian horror movies? Send an email to contrazoompod@gmail.com. There's a few people in particular I'm very curious to hear what their favorites are, whether it's Brody or Kyle McNabb or Taylor Beaumont. They're all big horror movie fans, so I'm curious to see if they've got some interesting picks as well. But thank you to Eric and Kevin Smale for the theme music and to Stephanie Pryor for the logo design. If you like to listen to podcasts on YouTube, we post all episodes there as well. And if you really like the show, consider tipping us on coffee. Thanks for checking us out.